Hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. Depending on where you're from, I would like to wish you a very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Thank you so much for taking time out and being a part of this session today. The webinar today is a training on the MITRE attack and how you can use it to stay ahead of adversarial tactics. So you might ask, why this webinar? How is this training going to be beneficial to you? Well, MITRE attack is a knowledge base of tactics, techniques, and procedures that an adversary might use to compromise an organization. Using this knowledge base, security professionals like yourselves can understand how attackers operate and be better prepared to defend your organizations. This becomes even more critical during the current times when attackers have become very sophisticated. They're constantly looking for new ways to compromise organizations and steal sensitive data. Threats such as fileless malware, living off the land attacks, and ransomware have become very common over the last few years. The attackers of today don't even need to download a malicious payload onto a victim's machine anymore. They can run the malware right off of memory and thus make it a fileless malware. Attackers have also started using built-in tools such as PowerShell to compromise Active Directory environments, and this is called living off the land. Apart from this, attackers are also leveraging the fear emanating from current world events to wreak havoc. For example, this year in 2020, many attacks took advantage of the fear of COVID-19. To protect against these new types of attacks, it becomes imperative that security professionals be updated about real-world observations on cybersecurity. Not just being updated about what's happening, security professionals should also be able to emulate adversaries' actions and build attack scenarios. They should be able to perform behavioral analytics, assess defense gaps, understand the maturity of their security operations center, and enrich their threat intelligence. MITRE attack can help with all of this, and we'll see how in the next 40 or 45 minutes or so. Now, before I go ahead, I'd like to make sure that you can see my screen and that you can also hear me properly. So if you can see my screen properly and you can also hear me loud and clear, could you please confirm this to me over chat, please? We'll just take about 10 to 15 seconds for this. Again, I'm looking for a few confirmations that my voice is audible and you can also see my screen. And if you don't have any technical difficulties, we can get started. All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much for those confirmations. Thank you, Marvin. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Terry. Thank you so much for those confirmations. Thanks a lot. Now, during this webinar, in case the voice or picture quality gets bad at any time, please bring it to my attention using the chat window, and I'll try to fix it right then and there. Also, during this webinar, please keep sending me your questions using the webinar panel. You should have an option there to send your questions. At the very end, I'll have some time set aside for Q&A. By the way, this webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive the recording over email soon. So just give us a couple of days, we'll process the recording and we'll be emailing it to you. Well, so now I've spoken for 3 minutes already and I'm yet to introduce myself. My name is Ram Vaidyanathan and I'm a cybersecurity specialist at ManageEngine. I've been with ManageEngine for the last 6 years now. In my role, I get to research about the latest techniques attackers are using against organizations, and I also get to learn from people like you. I get to learn from people like you about the ways in which organizations can stop attackers. People like you also give me a lot of insight about how things are developing in the cybersecurity market, and ManageEngine as a company uses this feedback to develop our security solutions. If you'd like to get in touch with me about anything, even if it's just to say hello, my email address is right there on your screen. It's ram.v@manageengine.com. I'd love to hear from you. Alternatively, you can also add me on LinkedIn. So with all of that said, it's time to start this webinar. Let's get rolling with the agenda and see what we have in store for today. We'll start off with a brief introduction to MITRE Corporation. Who exactly are the people who develop the attack framework? We'll then try to understand the MITRE attack framework. What are its different components and how do they all come together? We'll then go over tactics identified in this framework. It turns out there are 12 tactics that we can discuss here. Next up, we'll talk about techniques. What exactly are techniques and why should you know about them? And what are sub-techniques? Procedures are next in line. What are procedures and how can they help you solve your security challenges? At this time, after doing all of this, there'll be a small demo of an actual attack. We'll look at initial access, which is one of the tactics, and we'll primarily be looking at a specific technique within initial access called input capture. So we'll be looking at a couple of demos here. And then finally, we'll discuss how MITRE ATT&CK can help you and how you should get started with it. So first things first, let's get to know about MITRE Corporation. MITRE is a private non-profit organization that works in the public interest, and their stated vision is to solve problems for a safer world. They work on fields such as artificial intelligence, data science, health informatics, space security, cyber threat sharing, and cyber resilience. So they work on various fields, and they basically want to develop innovative ideas in cybersecurity. That happens to be one of their core activities. Their website states that they have been working closely with the government to strengthen cyber defenses for more than 4 decades. You all might know about the Department of Homeland Security in the US, which is a federal executive department responsible for public security. Well, MITRE works very closely with the DHS. MITRE was founded in the year 1958, so it has had a history of 62 years. The company has 2 main locations, one in Bedford, Massachusetts, and the other in McLean, Virginia. So that's a brief about the company. Let's now talk about the attack framework. Attack is a knowledge base or framework of adversarial tactics, techniques, sub-techniques, and procedures based on real-world observations. It stands for adversarial, tactics, techniques. The ampersand stands for and, common knowledge. So that's where the attack comes from. MITRE first started working on this knowledge base back in 2013. And the very first version of this knowledge base was released in 2015. Usually, every quarter, the framework undergoes some updates as new information on cyber attacks becomes available. Now, the greatest thing about this framework is that everybody can contribute to it, including you. The objective is to make this framework as comprehensive as possible, and that can only happen if information is shared freely amongst people in the world. So anyways, like it's apparent from the acronym here, the framework consists of tactics, in fact, 12 of them. Each tactic is a higher level technical goal that an adversary wants to achieve. These 12 tactics are, and I'm just going to read this off the list right here: initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation, defense evasion, credential access, discovery, lateral movement, collection, command and control, exfiltration, and impact. Now, apart from these 12 tactics, attack has also identified 2 pre-attack tactics, and those are reconnaissance and resource development. Now, these 2 tactics, reconnaissance and resource development, they are usually technical goals of attackers even before they launch an attack. So they are pre-attack tactics. So as you can see here, the first step is reconnaissance and the final step is impact. Attackers usually go step by step in the order that you see listed here in this slide. Now, obviously, it's not a given that an attacker will try to achieve each and every tactic that you see here. In fact, it might be their desire to get to exfiltration as quickly as possible, in as few steps as possible. We'll now need to talk about techniques. Techniques are the means by which an attacker achieves a tactic. So while a tactic is all about what they want to do, techniques are all about how they actually do it. For example, reconnaissance that we saw earlier, which is a tactic, could be achieved through 10 different techniques that you see here on the slide. So here are 10 different techniques using which attackers can achieve reconnaissance. These techniques are right here. Likewise, resource development has 6 techniques that you can see here. Initial access has 9 different techniques. And you also have exfiltration, that's got 9 different techniques as well. Likewise, we spoke about 12 different tactics, right? So each of those 12 tactics will have a multitude of techniques to achieve those tactics. Let's now take an example of initial access, which is also the very first tactic on this framework. Now, there are, like you can see, 9 different techniques by which initial access could be gained by an attacker. And one of these techniques to achieve initial access is phishing, and I've just highlighted that to you over here. Now, sub-techniques further break down behaviors described by techniques. They describe exactly what an attacker does to accomplish a technique. In a way, a sub-technique is a how behind the how. So you have a tactic, and that's called initial access. It's got 9 different techniques, and they're all listed here. Phishing happens to be one of the techniques for achieving initial access. And then phishing has 3 sub-techniques, and these are spear phishing attachment, spear phishing link, and spear phishing via service. Likewise, this framework may have several sub-techniques for all the identified techniques. So do you kind of see how this all comes together now? Take a look at this here. You've also got another technique for initial access called supply chain compromise, and it also happens to have 3 different sub-techniques, and those are listed here. Valid accounts is another technique for initial access, and it's got 4 different sub-techniques listed here. And here on this slide, what you will see is a full matrix of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It's a busy slide, but you can probably see what it is, and you kind of get an idea here. So now I hope you really see how this all comes together as one comprehensive knowledge base. But it doesn't stop here. For each technique and sub-technique, there could be specific implementations that the adversary uses, and these are called procedures. So yes, a procedure describes the instances of real-world applications of a technique. They help you understand particular examples and instances of use of a technique. For example, just in the last slide, we spoke of a sub-technique called spear phishing attachment. Now, this has several observed procedure examples. Several groups such as APT1, APT12, Leviathan, and Lazarus group have used this sub-technique, and these are listed as procedure examples in this framework. The MITRE ATT&CK framework also identifies threat groups from around the world that are involved in different types of attacks. And these groups perform different techniques and sub-techniques, and those are also listed here. So let's just navigate over to the groups page on the attack website. So here's the groups page, and you'll get to see the exact information that's listed out for you here. So this page, it's pretty comprehensive. If you want further details about a particular group, so let's just scroll down. Now, Lazarus is a particularly popular group. You might have heard about it. So we can actually get to know more about the Lazarus group by going into that group specific page here. And here you get to see an overview of this threat group called Lazarus group, where in the world it's based, and their associate groups can be seen down below. And also the techniques that are mainly used by this group. All of that can be seen here. So you can see how this framework is actually a very, very comprehensive database that you can use to defend your organization. Let's go back into the presentation. Now, for each technique and sub-technique, you'll also have a section on mitigations and detection. The mitigation section lists a number of things you can do to lessen the impact or come out of an attack. For example, you can mitigate phishing attacks by making use of antivirus or anti-malware that can automatically quarantine suspicious files. You can use network intrusion prevention systems that can scan and remove malicious email attachments. You may decide to restrict web-based content, especially if those websites are not necessary for business operations. Of course, user training is a big piece when it comes to mitigating phishing attacks. Users happen to be the weakest link, and they need to be trained to identify social engineering techniques and phishing emails. Now, what we can do is let's go over each of the tactics briefly. So we've got 12 tactics. We'll go over each of those 12 tactics briefly, And where possible, let's also bring up some techniques. This will give you a clear picture of how an attacker might traverse through a network. So the first tactic that we have is reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is the very first thing that a cybercriminal might do before launching an attack. They try to actively or passively gather information about the potential target. This can include details about the organization, the network infrastructure, and also details about the people who work there. And they may want to try and find out the types of behavior that these people exhibit. This step is very critical to the overall success of an attacker's campaign. The sophisticated attackers of today spend a considerable amount of time at this phase, because the more time that an attacker uses to do their research, the more success they're going to have. Some of the techniques attackers could use to accomplish reconnaissance are listed here. They could be gathering victim identity information such as employee names and their email addresses, or they could gather the victim's network information such as IP addresses and domain properties. Then you have resource development. After the initial research that happens during reconnaissance, adversaries try to build resources they can use for their nefarious activities. For example, they may purchase domains that can be used during their operations. You can see an example here. Let's say that there is an organization called Cello and its URL is www.cello.com. So that's cello.com. Attackers may make use of the malicious URL www.cello.com, but spelled with a zero here. So cell0.com. And this can be easily overlooked by human readers. So attackers are actually investing in a domain of this sort so that human readers can overlook it. The other techniques for resource development may involve the bad actors actually developing or even renting a botnet. A botnet is a network of compromised systems that can be instructed to perform a coordinated task. So for example, a DDoS attack can be accomplished by using a botnet. Yet another technique involves attackers developing specific capabilities. Before compromising a victim, adversaries may develop malware and malware components that can be used during targeting. Building malicious software can include the development of payloads, droppers, and backdoors. Adversaries may develop malware to support their operations, creating a means for maintaining control of remote machines, evading defenses, and executing post-compromise behaviors. And then you have initial access. This is the very first tactic within the actual attack. So remember, the first two tactics that we saw here, reconnaissance and resource development, they happen to be pre-attack tactics. Initial access is the first tactic within the actual attack. As the name suggests, initial access is all about an attacker trying to get a foothold into the network. Like we saw earlier, there are 9 different techniques identified under initial access. One of the most common techniques is phishing, and we saw that earlier. The other common technique for initial access is something called a drive-by compromise, using which adversaries may gain access to a system through a user visiting a website. In a drive-by compromise, what could happen is a user visits a website that has been spoofed by an attacker. From here, scripts automatically execute, and these scripts search the user's browser for vulnerabilities. An exploit code is then delivered to the browser. Next up, we have execution. With this tactic, the attacker tries to run a malicious code. Now, sometime back, I spoke about how the attackers of today are leveraging native tools to live off the land. Well, PowerShell is a very powerful tool that's readily available, and attackers can leverage this tool to achieve their objectives. Using PowerShell, adversaries can even execute a brute force attack or even ransomware. Then you have persistence. In this step, the attacker tries to maintain their presence in the network. This includes techniques that they use to keep access to systems even after restarts, change credentials, and other interruptions that could cut off access. One popular technique of persistence is creation of accounts. Now imagine a situation with me. Imagine a scenario in which an attacker has already compromised an account and got that initial access. Once they have initial access, at that stage, they may then create a new account to maintain access to victim systems. This newly created account could be a local account or even a domain account. The fourth tactic is privilege escalation. With this tactic, the adversary will try to gain higher level permissions. Attackers will want to do this because they typically enter the network with unprivileged or lower levels of access. They'll then want to elevate their privileges to accomplish their goals. Examples of elevated access include local administrator, user accounts with admin-like access, and user accounts with access to specific systems. So how exactly do they do this? What techniques do they use? Well, it turns out that one of the major techniques for privilege escalation is group policy modification. Here, the attacker tries to modify group policy objects or GPOs. You might be aware that GPOs have access controls associated with them. So the attacker tries to change all of this with this technique. And this can be very, very dangerous for any network environment. The next tactic is defense evasion. With defense evasion, the attacker tries to hide their tracks and avoid being detected. The techniques used for defense evasion include uninstalling or disabling security solutions or impairing defenses by disabling Windows event logging. You may be aware that Windows event logs record each and every user and system activity, such as successful and failed logons, process creations, group attribute changes, GPO changes, and more. This is the underlying data that security professionals use to monitor indicators of compromise and detect threats. So with this tactic of defense evasion, what the attacker wants to do, or tries to do at least, is try and delete all of that. And they want to hide their tracks that way. Another major technique for defense evasion involves file deletion. Attackers may delete files left behind by the actions of their intrusion activity. Malware may leave traces to indicate as to what was done within a network and also how. Removal of these files can occur during an intrusion or as part of a post-intrusion process to minimize the adversary's footprint and minimize their chances of being detected. There is another major technique attackers use to hide their tracks, and that is called masquerading. Masquerading occurs when the name or location of an object is manipulated or abused for the sake of evading defenses and observation. This may include manipulating file data and tricking users into misidentifying the file type. Renaming abusable system utilities to evade security monitoring is also a form of masquerading. Then you have credential access. This is the stage of an attack when adversaries try to steal account names and passwords. Some of the techniques used for credential access are brute force, input capture, and man in the middle. A brute force attack happens when an attacker continuously tries to guess a password using the repetitive or iterative mechanism. Adversaries may use a small list of commonly used passwords against many different accounts to try and break in. There is also something called a dictionary attack, right, which comes under brute force. So an attacker might use an iterative mechanism of a dictionary, and basically what it's going to do is it's going to run through all of those dictionary words against specific usernames, ultimately with the goal of trying to break in. Now, logins may be attempted with that password against many different accounts on a network to avoid account lockouts, because attackers are very, very sophisticated. They know that if they keep trying to log in or attempting to log in with just one username, it might lead to an account lockout. So they may give themselves some time, and they may not try to attempt to log into a user account within a specific period of time. Input capture happens when an attacker deceives the user into providing their credentials into what they believe is a genuine web portal. Adversaries may install code on externally facing portals to capture and transmit credentials of users who attempt to log into the service. For example, a compromised login page may log provided user credentials before logging the user into the service. So that's input capture. So what we can do now is let's do something interesting. Let's do a small demo of an input capture. Let's see how input capture may actually work and really how easy it is to accomplish. Now, there is a tool called Social Engineer Toolkit, and that is an open source Python-driven tool aimed at penetration testing around social engineering. It can be downloaded easily from GitHub. So I've got that GitHub page open for you here. And you can run this, you can download this off of this site and you can run it from Kali Linux. So I also have an instance of Kali Linux running for myself here. So this is my instance of Kali Linux. Let me quickly log in. And we're going to try and do a demo of input capture. So please follow along as I go through this. So here's my instance of Kali Linux. And I've also got a few other virtual machines set up over here. So here is one of my workstations. Here's my other workstation. And this happens to be a domain controller. And this is my attacker machine. This is Kali Linux. So on Kali Linux, we'll be running Social Engineer Toolkit that I just showed you and that I've already downloaded from GitHub. We'll then see how this technique of input capture can work. So let me open up a terminal in Kali Linux and I will cd into SE Toolkit. I've already downloaded it in this particular directory. And then let's power up SE Toolkit. So there, that's running now. We are going to do an input capture using a social engineering attack. So just choose one over here. And here, take a look at this. You have the option of doing a mass spear phishing attack, but you also have the option of performing a website attack, which can also be used for input capture. I'll just show this to you right now. So just go ahead and choose two website attack vectors. Now we'll be using the credential harvester attack method, which is number 3. And as you can read over here, the credential harvester method will utilize web cloning of a website that has a username and password field and harvest all the information posted to the website. So let's go ahead and hit 3. Now let's try the site cloner. This is going to completely clone a website of your choosing and allow you to utilize the attack vectors within the same web application you are trying to clone. So hit 2. Now, what's the IP address where you want all that information once it's been harvested? So that's the question it's asking us here. Let's have it as the same IP address of this particular machine. So the IP address of this machine is what you see here. So let me just go ahead and type it, 192.168.216.137. Just hit enter. Now, what's the URL that you want to clone? Let's pick facebook.com. So HTTP www.facebook.com and hit enter. And take a look at this information here. Take a look at what it says. Information will be displayed to you as it arrives below. So it's all ready to be up and running. All that it's waiting for is an input capture. So now what we'll do is let's go into a browser and let's type in that particular IP address. Don't mind the language here. It's a local language, but this is a login for Facebook. And let's try login and let's give a password and hit enter. And hopefully, if everything goes well, we've got to see something here. Take a look at this. We've got the input capture. So this is the email address that I entered in that clone website. So what you saw over there, where I was entering the credentials for facebook.com, that's nothing but a clone website, right? We actually went over to that site when I typed in that particular IP address. So the user was navigated over to that site, and then the user just gives their credentials. You saw that I typed in this particular email address for my login, for my username, and then this was the password I actually typed in. You couldn't see it, but the input capture can see it, and you've got a hold of it right here. So this, my friends, is how an input capture can actually work. Now, what can the attacker practically do from here? They can send a phishing email inviting users to this clone site and get a person's credentials. That's how simple it's going to be. Great. Now let's go back into the presentation. So that's about credential access. The next tactic is discovery. Now, with this tactic, the adversary is trying to figure out the intricacies of the organization's network environment. Domain enumeration is used by attackers to gain knowledge and plan how to act. Some of the things they attempt to discover are domain trusts, network shares, password policies, domain groups, and system information. Now let's do one more demo. Let's now get into this particular machine, this particular virtual machine that I showed to you over here before. So this is a workstation. It's been connected to this domain here. The domain is called comfort.local. And this particular machine is a domain controller. And we'll be running PowerShell from this particular workstation here. So we'll be performing domain enumeration with PowerShell. Now, numerous PowerShell exploit tools are available for download online. What I'll do is I'll just run a few commandlets in PowerShell and show you just how much even a normal user can learn about the domain using PowerShell. So let's go into PowerShell right away. And as you can see, I'm logged in as a regular user, Jay Riley. Now let me cd into downloads, and I'll explain why in just a moment. In my downloads folder, I've got this particular application called PowerView already downloaded off of GitHub. And PowerView is a powerful tool that's going to help us with domain enumeration. And we'll see how PowerView works in just a moment. So that's why I'm cding into downloads. So we have cd'd into downloads, and then we are going to do this particular commandlet, PowerShell -execution policy, or EP, bypass. With this commandlet, what's going to happen is we are going to be bypassing certain execution or security policies that are built into PowerShell. So any user on the domain can actually run this and bypass all of these security controls and then start enumerating a domain. So that's how simple it's going to be. And now let's power up PowerView. So you won't see anything right now, but PowerView is now running. And now what we're going to do is we're going to type up a few commandlets and see how domain enumeration actually takes place. So one of the first commandlets we can look at is get net domain and hit enter. Now this, as you can see, is going to give us details about the forest or the actual domain name. That's comfort.local. So we saw earlier that, this particular machine, right? We've got this machine here. This is our domain controller. So we're going to be getting all the information about this domain by running PowerShell on our workstation, just as a regular user. Take a look at this. So it's giving us information about our domain, and our domain controller is quinta-dc.comfort.local. Then let's try get net domain controller. This is going to give us information about the current domain controller. We can clearly see what the operating system and the version is. Take a look at this, the operating system and the version. We also see the IP address of the domain controller. Now, this is gold for an attacker, isn't it? The IP address. Get domain policy is another commandlet. This gives us the default domain policy of the current domain. As you can see here, we've got policies for Kerberos, system access, registry values, and so on. So this gives you the list of the domain policies. Now we can pick one of these policies and enumerate even further. For example, we can know more about the system access policies. That's always something interesting for attackers. So all that we need to do is get domain policy, system access. This tells us that the minimum password age is 1 day and the maximum password age is 42 days. The number of bad passwords before a lockout happens, take a look at this. That's actually set to 0. That means it's not even set in this domain. Now that's very good news for an attacker, isn't it? You also get to see the minimum password length here at the bottom. It's set to 7 characters. So if an attacker wants to do a password spray or brute force attack, this is again very good information that they can make use of. Next command that we can look at is get user property properties password last set. Take a look at this. Again, very powerful information for any attacker or pen tester. This tells us exactly when each user in the domain last set their password. It gives us both the date and the time this was last done. Get net computer. We can very easily get a list of all the computers on the domain with this command. In our simple lab setup, we have these 3 computers: Quinta, Hilton, and Radisson. Get net group member, group name, domain admins. Now, even before I tell you what this command is going to do, I think you probably have a fair idea what it's going to do. Let me just hit enter. Take a look at this information right here. It'll give us a list of all the user accounts that are part of the group domain admins. Again, very valuable information if someone is trying to enumerate a domain. Another command that we can look at is invoke share finder. This command will give us all the shares on all the hosts in the current domain. If I were an attacker, I would be very interested in this particular network share. It's called classified. The name is very, very telling. It's probably going to have a lot of classified information. And I get to know about this. So that's where, this domain enumeration with this particular commandlet is going to help me. Get net GPO. This can be used to get all the GPOs in the domain. So that's how domain enumeration can work. And you probably see like what an attacker can do in order to get to know more information about a domain, discover more information about a domain before taking it down. So let's go back into the presentation now. So what we've seen is discovery. The next tactic in the MITRE ATT&CK framework is lateral movement. Here, the adversary is trying to move through the network environment. For example, they may use internal spear phishing to gain access to additional information or exploit other users within the same organization. Internal spear phishing is a multi-staged attack where an email account is owned either by controlling the user's device with previously installed malware or by compromising the account credentials of the user. Adversaries attempt to take advantage of a trusted internal account to increase the likelihood of tricking the target into falling for the phish attempt. So a cyber criminal may create an exact spoof of an established person or organization that the recipient has a relationship with. And then what they do is they gain trust. They gain trust to deliver the fraud. For example, the email comes from an infrastructure controlled by the cyber criminal, but appears to come from a legitimate person because the email address is identical. Collection is the next tactic. Put simply, this is the stage at which attackers try to gather data of interest to their goal. The MITRE ATT&CK framework identifies common target sources such as drive types, browsers, audio, video, and email. Common collection methods include capturing screenshots and keyboard input. Some of the techniques of collection include an adversary searching local system sources such as file systems or local databases to find files of interest and sensitive data. Adversaries may also search for network shares on computers they have compromised to find files of interest. Another collection technique involves the attacker compressing data. Compressing the data helps to obfuscate the data and minimizes the amount of data sent over the network. And then there's command and control. In this stage of the attacker tries to communicate with compromised systems to control them. For example, adversaries may communicate using application layer protocols associated with web traffic to avoid detection by blending in with the existing traffic. Commands to the remote system will be embedded within the protocol traffic between the client and the server. Protocols such as HTTP and HTTPS that carry web traffic may be very common in environments. Now, HTTP has packets and they have many fields, right? And headers as well in the data. And the kind of communication that attackers try to send in these packets can then be concealed in these headers. Now, let's discuss exfiltration, or tactic number 11. The larger technical goal here is the stealing of sensitive data. Techniques for getting data out of a target network typically include transferring it over their command and control channel or an alternate channel, and may also include putting size limits on the transmission. You have several techniques here, such as automated exfiltration and exfiltration over USB. And finally, tactic number 12, you have impact. In this final stage, the adversary tries to manipulate, interrupt, or destroy the organization's systems and data. Account access removal, data destruction, defacement, and disk wipe are some of the major techniques used for impact. So there you have it. What we did today was a brief but solid overview of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We went over the 12 different tactics that adversaries could use, different techniques within each tactic, and different sub-techniques within each technique. We also discussed about procedures, groups, and mitigation strategies. Then we took a step back and saw how attackers can actually implement certain techniques like input capture for credential access and domain enumeration for discovery. Now, since all of this information is available at one place for you within the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, this framework will enable you to follow a structured approach to defending against threats. If you want to learn more about going deeper into this framework, that's really great. We have another webinar coming up next month, and it's kind of like a part 2 of this particular training. In that webinar, we'll specifically talk about how you can bring the MITRE ATT&CK framework into a SIEM solution for enhanced threat detection. There will also be a live demo of how Manage Engine Log 360 applies the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So I invite you all to register for that webinar. So what I'll do is I'll just post the registration link on the chat right now. So if you're interested, you can always register for this webinar as well. It's coming up next month. So I've just pasted the URL on the chat for you. So if you're interested in part 2 of this training, please do register for this webinar. Okay, so that's the end of my talk today. But before I let you go for the day, I do have a couple of polls to run. These polls will be launched on your screen right now. If you can take a moment to answer these questions for me, that'll be really, really great. So let me just go ahead and quickly launch this poll right now. So you'll see 2 questions on your screen right now. Question number 1, how do you know Manage Engine Log 360? And then question number 2 is, do you want our product specialist to assist you with a free evaluation of the solution? So if you can answer these 2 questions for me, that'll be really amazing. It will help us serve you better. Obviously, in a 45-minute webinar like this one, there is only so much that I can cover. But in case you want to see how the MITRE ATT&CK framework can be used in your organizations and how it can be beneficial for you, please do let us know. I will be happy to take you through it. I see a lot of responses coming through, so let's just give it 10 more seconds. All right, thank you so much. Now I have one more poll to run, and this is all about the session feedback. So if you could take a moment to answer these 4 questions that you see on your screen right now. How was this webinar experience for you? That'll be great feedback for me. And with that, I thank you. Just as you're answering those questions, on behalf of Manage Engine, I thank you. I'll still be online for the next 10 minutes, taking your questions on chat. So please do keep sending me your questions. And until next time, please take care. Thank you so much.